everybody. Welcome back to the Brewing Bright Minds podcast. We are enjoying our discussion about what our kids actually are learning in the preschool classrooms. And now we are going to dig deep into infants, what really takes place in the infant classroom. How are we creating opportunities for learning in the infant classroom? What should parents expect for them to be learning? And how do we carry that out?
Yeah, and just learning in general, because I feel like the infant and toddler ages is when most people look at classrooms as just a daycare, and realizing that it is not just a daycare. Yes, of course, we are caring for them and their needs, but we are also teaching. And so infant and toddler teachers are just as important as kindergarten teachers.
Absolutely. And it takes a lot, though. If anything, they are juggling so much more at these ages to prepare them in terms of just safety and development, but also their learning. So, because they're juggling it all. They're juggling it all at once, whereas their care is priority, of course. We want to make sure that they are clean and fed and well rested and loved and developing secure relationships with their teachers and their friends. And then once that really critical foundation is set, then all right, let's play. Let's do a sensory activity. Let's do an art activity. Let's do music and movement, because their brain and their whole body and their state is ready to learn.
Yeah, and it's so important to note that foundation needs to be set first, because you cannot do a lesson with an infant on their very first day of school. They will be crying all day long because they need to build that relationship with their teacher, build the relationship with their peers, with the other babies in the room. They need to be comfortable in the classroom. They've never been outside of home before. They need to be comfortable in their sleeping environment. This is the first time they're sleeping outside of the home. And that may take a couple weeks. So I think sometimes certain parents may think, oh, it's my child's first day of school ever. They're 7 months old. I can't wait to see this art activity, this art and craft come home on the first day. And that's just not realistic. It takes a few weeks. And of course, their schedule, if they're there 5 days a week, if they're there less. And sometimes it takes children 2 weeks to adjust to their new classroom. And sometimes it takes 2 months to adjust to their new classroom. And so that's where the patience comes in for the teachers and the parents.
Yes. So just as every child needs that foundation set so that they are primed for most effective learning that takes place like this. This is their first experience in a classroom. Of course, the infant classroom looks different from any other classroom, but it is a classroom, and they know that it is, you should call it school. They are going to school because they have teachers, they have friends, they're learning how to function outside of their, immediate caregivers. They're learning how to be their own person in the context of a classroom and other friends, and having their voice and learning to express their needs and what they want and all that. So it's just huge. It's just so huge. So just making sure that you feel really comfortable with the teachers in that room, that you feel like your child can build strong relationships with that caregiver. And ultimately, you need to feel like they're going to be loved.
Yes.
They really, really, really need to be held and loved and cared for, so that the kids feel comfortable and so that the kids feel secure to explore. Only when they feel comfortable will they explore the classroom and engage and socialize with other kids.
Yeah, and the infant room is really, truly where their learning begins. It's the very first step of their school experience. If your child is going to be in a care-based setting until they go to elementary school, this is the first learning, where, it's the first step.
Yes, and they do have a curriculum. Our infant teachers do have a curriculum that they set, and they do hit the domains just as all the other classrooms. Yeah. So they do have, sensory, which at this point in their development, they need to kind of learn how to process how they take in information through their senses.
Yeah.
And so having them have a lot of sensory activities so that they can explore, and teachers narrating and giving them vocabulary and building language skills through their activities is so crucial, because that's just building their knowledge, their word bank. Even if they're not saying words, they're understanding you. Mm-hmm. You're building those fundamental language skills, which we touched upon in our last episode. Of that has to be laid. Those bricks have to be laid, and even though it doesn't seem like it doesn't, like they're just finger painting, they're just splashing and playing with, those toys. Even though it doesn't look like it, they are truly gaining foundational skills that help them build their learning.
Yeah. And I think the three most crucial domains that we teach in our infant room that I think a lot of infant classrooms do as well is definitely the gross motor, the fine motor, and the language. Mm-hmm. Language mm-hmm. is so huge, because even though they may not talk mm-hmm. until they're 12 months plus old, they are hearing it constantly from their teachers. And that is why a lot of infant teachers will lose their voice at the end of the day, because they're literally talking mm-hmm. for 8 hours a day mm-hmm. straight. And of course, every teacher is, mm-hmm. but infant teachers are doing it while they're changing diapers, mm-hmm. while they're feeding them, mm-hmm. while they're playing with them, mm-hmm. while they're trying to teach a lesson. Like, they are talking so much. And again, like I mentioned, every teacher does. But that is how these babies are soaking up the words and the vocabulary. And again, even though they're not necessarily having a back and forth conversation quite yet, they are soaking it in.
Yes, they are learning to process that information. They are learning to label. And as they get older, you'll see they will respond, and maybe not verbally, but mm-hmm. they'll follow your direction. They'll look in the direction of what you're talking about. They'll look at the friend that you're speaking mm-hmm. about. And so those are the language skills that you really want to build early on, because it's just communication skills. Yeah. You really want them to be able to communicate with you verbally and non-verbally, and know how to speak up or communicate when opportunities present themselves, because that's what you want. If they're not processing, then you're not getting a response from them. Right. So you really have to constantly immerse them in that language-rich environment so that they're constantly processing it and building those skills.
Right. And going along with the motor skills, the mm-hmm. physical development, that is, the gross motor development is just so huge and crucial for a child in a school setting, because if they are just getting dropped off and sitting all day long, if the teachers are not actively engaging and trying to work on their gross motor, then they're not going to crawl or walk or sit up on their own for quite some time. And so a lot of times during the day, the infant teacher is walking with the child, mm-hmm. When they're holding their arms mm-hmm. up, or holding their hand while they're walking, or having them on their hands and knees and sitting next to them. Just all of the gross development that the teachers are really actively working on. And that may not necessarily be in their lesson plan mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. per se, or that might not be something that's in their lesson plan, but it's something that they're doing constantly all mm-hmm. day long.
Yes. And that's really key, because, in the early stages in infancy, there are easy tells, right, of when they are developing in a timely manner. And so gross and fine motor skills are a major area of that. And even if they're not really feeling like they're motivated to do so, because we hear all the time, they don't really want to walk. Yeah. They don't really want to crawl. They're not really showing those signs at home, but at school they will, because they are in a class with various ages and they see their peers walking. They see their peers eating solid food. They see their peers, climbing and doing those things. That's going to motivate them to try and explore and do things that they're not necessarily comfortable with. And that's what you want.
Right. Of course, crawling and sitting up and standing and walking, it is a natural instinct and their bodies will eventually do it. But with the help of a caregiver, a teacher or a parent or a nanny, they could do it earlier.
Yes.
They could meet the milestone age. And really, they, like you're saying, will be motivated to do it because if their teacher is constantly having them stand up, they're picking them up, they're walking around, and then when they go put them back down, they're putting them on their feet or they're putting them on their bottom, So working on that, actively working on it day in and day out, that will help motivate them to do it. Because if you kind of just sit back and say, oh, they'll walk on their own.
Yeah.
They may not walk until 18 months old.
Yeah.
You know?
You can't just let time do it. You need to encourage it. And again, if they're practicing every day, they're learning, this is something I don't know how to do. I feel uncomfortable as Miss Dom is holding me in this stance. My feet are not necessarily, they'll feel it. My feet are not necessarily that strong yet.
Yeah.
I can't really do it. But if you persist, you're teaching them again, the core value of persevering, being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And then when they can do it, when they do take their first steps at home or at school, or they do take their first, crawling moves, then they feel confident.
Yeah.
They feel capable and they're like, wow, I did it. And even at such a young age, they do feel that sense of accomplishment. We see our babies all the time get so excited. And so that's what you want in a program. You, of course, want them to have all those opportunities because that's in essence the name of our of what we it's called milestones. And so every little milestone is a huge accomplishment and we celebrate those, but it takes every day to get there.
I do want to touch on the importance of emotional regulation in an infant classroom, because when the average person thinks of babies, they think of crying and they think, oh, they're a baby. They're just gonna cry. They're just crying. They're crying. Which, yes, and crying is a natural instinct, and crying is a way of the child communicating with their caregiver. You can even get it down to this cry means that they're hungry, and this cry means that they're tired. I know I used to do that with some of the babies, but emotional regulation in the infant room, it can be taught by the teachers that if they are communicating that they're crying, that they're hungry, and the teacher says, oh, I can hear that you're crying. You must be hungry. Let's go get your food. Let's go sit at the table. And you can actually see that when a child starts crying because they're hungry and a teacher starts that conversation, the baby will stop crying because they know my teacher's walking to the refrigerator to get my food. Yeah. And they're walking to the table to put my food down. And that's something that they learn over time, that they're in the room. But that is emotional regulation. They are learning to regulate their emotions by, I'm crying, I'm telling my teacher that I'm hungry. Now I see my teacher walking to the refrigerator, so I'm going to stop crying. Yes. And that it could be for anything, for sleepy, for, this child's too close to me, or I'm getting frustrated with this toy. They're regulating their emotions in the infant room. And then you'll notice in the toddler room, most of the time, the children in the toddler room, if they started in the infant room, do not cry as much because they know how to regulate their emotions. Yes. And they know how to communicate their needs. Yes.
And that's what I was also going to touch upon is, yes, they have their feelings, their big feelings, and they are communicating them in the only way they know, crying, but with their caregiver, they're learning other methods because eventually food, I want my food, I'm crying, I want my food. Eventually they'll be like, I'm just going to walk over to the fridge.
Yeah. And point.
And point.
Yes.
I'm hungry. I don't need to cry anymore.
Yes.
I am hungry. I'm going to stand by the fridge. And they do this.
Yeah. And they even, and I will say this for the rest of my life, that when a child starts weaning off of their binky, they cry because they want their binky because it's soothing. And then eventually over time, they'll start to regulate their emotions and self-soothe by themselves without a binky. And there's, we even had a child in the infant room who, they were very, very attached to their binky, and we started kind of hiding it for small amounts of times. And they started pointing to their mouth and saying like the first word or the first syllable of the word binky. And they were starting to realize, like, to communicate in a different way than crying. They start saying "buh," and they start pointing to their mouth. Yeah. And they're not crying anymore. Yeah. They're using their language skills. Yes. And they're building their language skills. And that's all part of emotional regulation and language. But they knew that, okay, my teacher isn't just going to give me my binky because I'm crying. They're going to give me my binky because I'm saying the word binky, or I'm pointing to my mouth. And that could be used for many other things. That could be used for food or for bottle. I've even heard a lot of infants say bottle or milk. And that's where sign language comes in. And
yes, of course. So all those fundamental skills are being built because the child or the children are in an environment that allows them those opportunities to communicate. Because when you're at home, honestly, mom's going to feed you when it's time to feed you. Yeah. And we know their schedule, but also the kids have more autonomy. They have a voice.
And when they're at home in their own home, of course, they're going to get everything they want because they're the only child in their home. And of course, you know, but at school, they'll learn, not necessarily for our infants because they eat, you know, whenever, but in our older classrooms, they know I'm hungry and lunchtime is coming soon because we're doing this. And then this happens next. And then we eat lunch.
Yeah, they learn routine and they get security from the routine, and they can anticipate what's next, and that also helps them regulate. Because if they're feeling a little wiggly, well, I know after I eat, I'm going to go outside and play, so I'm going to be just fine. Yeah. And so they really thrive with that routine and that schedule.
And something that goes along with emotional regulation is the social aspect. A lot of the times you'll hear social emotional or social emotional development. Those two words kind of go hand in hand, especially in the early childhood world. And so in a school setting, in a classroom setting in the infant room, they are learning social skills very, very early on that they might not get if they start school at 2.5 or 3 years old. If they start school as early as infancy, they are learning these social cues and how to work as a team, and also just that there's other children their own age. Yeah. And so something that comes to mind is that kind of goes along with what we said about problem solving in the infant room. If there is a certain toy that a child is kind of pulling back and forth, they don't have the language to say like, that's mine. You know, they're just kind of pulling it back and forth. They're learning, I want this, but so does my friend. And so I'm going to keep pulling it back and forth, and my teacher might not intervene quite yet, but I'll let go and I'll let this child use it. And they learn that. Yeah. They truly do. Or if there's more than one toy and they learn to share. Yeah. In infancy. And then when they go into their preschool classroom at 3 years old, there is so much less of that because they learned it so early. Yes. Well, they've learned that sometimes I get what I want. Yes. And sometimes I don't, and I'm disappointed, but that's the way that's the way it goes. And they learn to be disappointed, and they learn that it will be my turn soon, but it's okay to feel sad right now about it because I'll get it eventually. Yeah. And so taking turns is huge. I mean, we have kids in the oldest class still having problems with taking turns. And so they really do learn that in infancy, and you can see it. You can see it on their face. You can see they're like, ugh, not cool. Or they cry. Or maybe they scream. You know, like they learn it. And even just like you mentioned that they are not the only child. Yes. And so this might be something that's a little hard for some parents to have their child go to a school-based setting. The fact that they're not the only child. And that's kind of when you realize that maybe a nanny or something is better. But
Basically, they learn
Take turns.
to take turns, and they learn to deal with disappointment. But it's okay because they are in the comfort of their classroom with teachers that love them, and so it's a very safe environment to learn those skills and those life those life realities. Another thing that's really huge, I think, in the infant room that builds on is learning hygiene and self-care. I didn't know this until we opened our school, but after every diaper change, the infant washes their hands.
Yes.
And I was like, I do not do that for my child at home.
Yeah, and that's something that you would never know unless you are in a school. A parent would never know that unless the teacher tells them. But yes, after every single diaper change, before and after eating. Yep. After every diaper change, before and after going outside.
This is a licensing requirement.
Yes, a state licensing requirement. They are washing their hands 20 times a day.
Yeah.
But yes, they have to wash their hands after they change their diaper. And at first, for the first couple weeks, a child will absolutely hate washing their hands. Babies will hate washing their hands to the point where a teacher's pulling their arms into the water. Yeah.
For teachers to wash.
Yeah. You are like, you're leaning them into the sink and they're crying and it's this awful couple seconds and it's, you're washing their hands and it's awful. But then a month later, they are sticking their hands in the water for they are jumping to the sink. Yeah. They are asking for more soap. They are not wanting to leave. I even had a child one time where I was literally pulling their arms and I would feel so bad, of course. And then a month later, I would have to pull them away from the water. And then they would cry from not being in the water anymore because they're learning that washing hands is fun. And you put soap on your hands and things like that. But it's not, that's a learned skill.
Yes.
And so, yes, infants in an infant classroom are washing their hands 20 or more times a day. And at first, it's going to be an awful experience for the caregiver and the child. But then they get used to it and then they love it. And now even in our preschool classroom, our 2.5 to 3.5 classroom, those kids wash their hands better than I do sometimes. They are scrubbing in between their fingers. They're scrubbing under their nails.
We're really showing them how to. Yeah.
They are washing their hands for 20 seconds. They know when to turn the water off. They know when to grab a paper towel. And they're 2 years old because they learned that in the infant and toddler classroom.
Yes. And that may sound great, but maybe a little silly, but it's important to show that hygiene and cleanliness is important for just, your health, but also it gives them autonomy and it gives them self-sufficiency skills where, again, it builds confidence. So it's just so crucial. And starting it at the youngest age, it just makes that skill and that value stronger as they grow.